most significant transformations in Russian economic history, creating the foundation for the empire's emergence as a major industrial power, while generating social tensions that would ultimately threaten imperial stability. The emperor's commitment to economic modernization reflected his understanding that military strength and international prestige required industrial capabilities that could support modern armed forces while providing the economic resources necessary for great power status. The appointment of Ivan Vishnegradsky as finance minister in 1887 marked the beginning of systematic government efforts to promote industrial development through protective tariffs, foreign investment, and infrastructure construction. The protective tariff of 1891 represented the most comprehensive attempt to promote Russian industrial development through trade policy, imposing substantial duties on imported manufactured goods while encouraging domestic production. The tariff's rates, among the highest in Europe, effectively protected Russian manufacturers from foreign competition, while generating revenue that could be used to finance industrial development and infrastructure construction. The policy's implementation required careful coordination with foreign policy objectives to avoid retaliatory measures that might damage Russian agricultural exports, which remained essential for maintaining the empire's balance of payments. The recruitment of foreign capital and technical expertise became a central component of Russian industrial development, with the government actively encouraging European investors to establish manufacturing facilities within the empire. French capital played a particularly important role in financing Russian industrial development, with French banks and investors providing the resources necessary for major infrastructure projects and manufacturing enterprises. The influx of foreign investment brought advanced technology and management techniques to Russian industry, while creating international economic relationships that would influence Russian foreign policy throughout the remainder of the imperial period. The appointment of Sergei Witte as finance minister in 1892 marked the beginning of the most systematic and successful period of Russian industrial development, with policies that would transform the empire's economic structure while creating the foundation for 20th century industrial growth. Witte's background as a railway administrator provided him with practical experience in large-scale economic planning and management, while his understanding of international finance enabled him to develop sophisticated strategies for attracting foreign investment and managing the empire's fiscal resources. His appointment reflected Alexander III's recognition that economic modernization required professional expertise and systematic planning, rather than the traditional reliance on administrative improvisation. The Trans-Siberian Railway project, initiated during Alexander III's reign and continued under Witte's direction, represented the most ambitious infrastructure undertaking in Russian history and one of the greatest engineering achievements of the 19th century. The decision to construct a railway connecting European Russia with the Pacific Ocean reflected both strategic and economic considerations, providing reliable transportation for military forces while opening Siberian resources to development and settlement. The project's enormous scale, spanning over 5,000 miles of difficult terrain through forests, mountains, and frozen tundra, required unprecedented coordination of engineering, financial, and administrative resources. The railway's construction began simultaneously from multiple points along the proposed route, with separate sections built from Moscow eastward, from Vladivostok westward, and from various intermediate points to accelerate the project's completion. The engineering challenges involved in crossing the Ural Mountains, bridging major rivers, and maintaining construction operations in extreme weather conditions required innovative solutions and enormous expenditures of human and material resources. The recruitment of workers from throughout the empire, including prisoners, soldiers, and voluntary labourers attracted by high wages, created temporary communities along the construction route that demonstrated the project's impact on Russian society. The development of the Donbas coal and steel region during Alexander III's reign created the foundation for Russian heavy industry, while demonstrating the effectiveness of government policies designed to promote industrial concentration and specialization. The region's coal deposits, combined with iron ore from nearby sources, provided the raw materials necessary for large-scale steel production, while government investment in transportation infrastructure connected the region with major markets throughout the empire. The establishment of major steel works, including the Yuzovka plant founded by Welsh entrepreneur John Hughes, created industrial centres that employed thousands of workers while producing materials essential for railway construction and military equipment. The growth of the textile industry, particularly in the Moscow region, demonstrated the success of protective tariffs and government policies designed to promote light industry that could serve domestic markets while providing employment for the growing urban population. The expansion of cotton textile production, based on imported raw materials and domestic labour, created industrial enterprises that competed successfully with foreign manufacturers while generating profits that could be reinvested in further industrial development. The concentration of textile production in specific regions created industrial centres that attracted workers from rural areas while generating the commercial activity necessary for urban development. The development of anti-Semitic policies during Alexander III's reign represented one of the most shameful aspects of the counter-reform programme, reflecting the emperor's willingness to use ethnic and religious prejudice as tools of social control, while deflecting popular discontent away from the government and toward vulnerable minority populations. The May Laws of 1882, implemented following a series of pogroms in southern Russia, imposed comprehensive restrictions on Jewish residents, occupation and property ownership that effectively created a system of legal discrimination unprecedented in its scope and severity. These measures reflected the government's belief that Jewish economic activity contributed to peasant poverty and social unrest, while Jewish involvement in revolutionary movements threatened imperial security. The restriction of Jewish residents to the Pale of Settlement, encompassing the western provinces of the empire where Jewish communities had historically been concentrated, prevented Jewish migration to other regions while limiting economic opportunities and creating overcrowding that contributed to poverty and social tensions. The prohibition on Jewish land ownership and agricultural activity eliminated traditional occupations while forcing Jewish communities to concentrate in trade and crafts that often brought them into conflict with Christian competitors. The limitation of Jewish access to higher education through quota systems prevented the development of professional careers while creating resentment among educated Jewish youth who found their aspirations blocked by discriminatory policies. The state-sponsored pogroms that occurred during Alexander III's reign represented the most violent manifestation of official anti-Semitic policy, with government authorities either organising attacks on Jewish communities or deliberately failing to prevent violence that they could have easily suppressed. The pogroms in Kishinev, Odessa and other cities involved systematic destruction of Jewish property, assault and murder of Jewish residents, and the displacement of entire communities that had existed for generations. The government's response to these events typically involved blaming Jewish victims for provoking Christian anger while failing to prosecute those responsible for the violence. The economic impact of anti-Semitic policies extended beyond their direct effects on Jewish communities to influence the broader development of Russian commerce and industry. The exclusion of Jewish entrepreneurs from many economic activities eliminated sources of capital and expertise that might have contributed to industrial development, while the restriction of Jewish residents prevented the development of commercial networks that could have facilitated trade and investment. The international criticism that Russian anti-Semitic policies generated damaged the empire's reputation, while complicating diplomatic relationships with European powers that had substantial Jewish populations. The use of anti-Semitic propaganda as a tool of social control reflected the government's systematic attempt to channel popular discontent towards minority populations, while deflecting criticism from imperial policies and social conditions. The publication of anti-Semitic literature, including fabricated accounts of Jewish ritual murder and economic exploitation, created an atmosphere of suspicion and hatred that could be mobilized to support government policies while preventing the development of broader social criticism. The promotion of anti-Semitic attitudes among the Orthodox clergy and conservative intellectuals provided ideological justification for discriminatory policies while presenting anti-Semitism as a patriotic and religious duty. The industrial development that accelerated during Alexander III's reign created new social tensions and labour conflicts that would ultimately threaten the stability that the counter-reform programme was designed to maintain. The concentration of workers in industrial centres created communities with shared interests and grievances that could be organised for collective action, while the harsh working conditions and low wages that characterised early Russian industrialisation generated resentment that revolutionary organisations could exploit. The government's response to labour unrest typically involved the use of military force and administrative punishment rather than attempts to address underlying economic grievances. The Morozov strike of 1885 at a textile factory near Moscow demonstrated both the potential for organised labour action and the government's determination to suppress worker protests through force and legal penalties. The strike, involving over 8,000 workers protesting wage cuts and harsh working conditions, required military intervention to suppress, while resulting in the arrest and trial of strike leaders who were prosecuted for criminal conspiracy. The government's response to the strike included both repressive measures against worker organisations and limited labour legislation that established minimum standards for working conditions while prohibiting the formation of independent labour unions. The death of Alexander III on November 1, 1894, at the relatively young age of 49, thrust his eldest son Nicholas onto the throne at a moment when the Russian Empire required strong, decisive leadership to navigate the mounting challenges of modernisation, social unrest, and international competition. The new emperor, at 26 years of age, possessed neither the imposing physical presence nor the iron will that had characterised his father's reign. Standing 5 feet 7 inches tall with a slight build, Nicholas II appeared almost fragile compared to his massive predecessor, while his gentle blue eyes and neatly trimmed beard conveyed an impression of sensitivity that would prove both a personal virtue and a political liability. His preference for quiet family life over the ceremonial demands of imperial rule reflected a temperament fundamentally unsuited to the autocratic responsibilities he had inherited. Nicholas's education had prepared him for eventual succession, but had failed to develop the political instincts and administrative skills necessary for effective governance during a period of rapid social and economic transformation. His tutors, including the conservative Konstantin Pobednostsev, had emphasized traditional autocratic principles and orthodox religious values, while providing limited exposure to the practical challenges of modern statecraft. The young emperor's diary entries from his early years on the throne revealed a man overwhelmed by the complexity of imperial administration and uncertain about how to balance competing demands from different social groups and government departments. His tendency to avoid difficult decisions and his susceptibility to the influence of the last person he had spoken with created an atmosphere of policy inconsistency that would characterize his entire reign. The emperor's marriage to Princess Alexandra of Hesse-Darmstadt in November 1894, just weeks after his accession, introduced additional complications to Russian imperial politics through the influence of a consort whose German origins and reserved personality made her unpopular with Russian society. Alexandra's conversion to Orthodox Christianity and her adoption of the name Alexandra Fyodorovna failed to overcome the suspicions of a population that viewed her as a foreign influence on imperial policy. Her intense religiosity and belief in autocratic principles reinforced Nicholas's conservative instincts while isolating the imperial couple from the broader currents of Russian intellectual and political life. The empress's later involvement with the controversial religious figure Grigory Rasputin would further damage the monarchy's reputation and credibility. The industrial expansion that had accelerated during Alexander III's reign continued under Nicholas II's rule, creating unprecedented economic growth while generating social tensions that would ultimately threaten imperial stability. Sergei Witter's continuation as finance minister ensured policy continuity and promoting industrial development through foreign investment, protective tariffs, and infrastructure construction. The completion of the Trans-Siberian Railway in 1904 represented the culmination of this development strategy, providing reliable transportation across the empire while opening vast territories for settlement and resource extraction. However, the social costs of rapid industrialization, including harsh working conditions, low wages, and urban overcrowding, created grievances that revolutionary organizations could exploit to mobilize opposition to imperial authority. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 emerged from competing imperial ambitions in East Asia and exposed fundamental weaknesses in Russian military organization and strategic planning that would have catastrophic consequences for the empire's domestic stability. The conflict's origins lay in Russian expansion into Manchuria and Korea, territories that Japan viewed as essential for its own security and economic development. Nicholas II's decision to pursue an aggressive Far Eastern policy reflected his belief that, military victory would enhance imperial prestige while uniting Russian society behind the throne. The emperor's confidence in Russian military superiority, based on the empire's vast population and recent industrial development, proved tragically misplaced when confronted with Japanese forces that possessed superior training, equipment, and leadership. The Japanese surprise attack on Port Arthur on February 8, 1904, demonstrated the effectiveness of modern naval warfare, while revealing the vulnerability of Russian forces operating at the end of extended supply lines. The assault, conducted without a declaration of war, caught the Russian Pacific Fleet unprepared and inflicted severe damage on warships anchored in what had been considered a secure harbour. Admiral Oscar Stark's failure to anticipate the attack or organise effective defensive measures reflected the complacency that had characterised Russian military planning in the Far East. The loss of several major warships in the opening hours of the conflict eliminated Russian naval superiority in the region, while providing Japan with the strategic initiative that would determine the war's outcome. The Siege of Port Arthur, lasting from August 1904 to January 1905, became a symbol of Russian military incompetence and the futility of the empire's Far Eastern ambitions. General Anatoly Stesel's defense of the fortress demonstrated individual courage, while revealing systematic failures in military preparation and strategic planning. The garrison's inadequate supplies, obsolete fortifications, and poor coordination with relief forces created conditions that made successful defense impossible despite the heroic efforts of individual soldiers and officers. The Japanese assault, conducted with methodical precision and overwhelming firepower, gradually reduced the fortress's defences while inflicting enormous casualties on both sides. The fall of Port Arthur on January 2, 1905, marked the most humiliating military defeat in Russian history and shattered the myth of European military superiority over Asian forces. General Stesel's surrender of the fortress, conducted against the wishes of many subordinate officers who believed continued resistance was possible, eliminated Russia's primary naval base in the Pacific, while freeing Japanese forces for operations against Russian field armies in Manchuria. The surrender's terms, which allowed Russian forces to return home rather than face imprisonment, reflected Japanese magnanimity, but could not disguise the completeness of Russian defeat or its implications for imperial prestige. The Battle of Mukden, fought from February 20th to March 10th, 1905, represented the largest land engagement of the war and demonstrated the superiority of Japanese military organisation over Russian forces despite the latter's numerical advantage. General Alexei Kuropatkin's army, numbering approximately 370,000 troops, faced Marshal Iwao Oyama's Japanese forces of 270,000 in a confrontation that would determine control over southern Manchuria. The battle's scale, involving over 600,000 combatants across a front extending nearly 100 miles, required coordination and communication capabilities that exceeded Russian military competence, while playing to Japanese strengths in tactical flexibility and aggressive leadership. The Russian defensive positions around Mukden, constructed over several months of preparation, included elaborate trench systems, artillery emplacements, and communication networks that should have provided significant advantages against attacking forces. However, the fortifications' design reflected outdated military principles that failed to account for the effectiveness of modern artillery and the importance of coordinated infantry-artillery cooperation. The Japanese assault, launched simultaneously from multiple directions, overwhelmed Russian defensive preparations through superior coordination and the effective use of artillery that had been carefully positioned to support advancing infantry formations. The collapse of Russian resistance at Mukden occurred with shocking rapidity once Japanese forces achieved breakthrough points in the defensive line. The retreat of Russian forces, conducted in bitter cold and deep snow, became a rout that eliminated organised resistance while leaving behind enormous quantities of military equipment and supplies. Kuropatkin's inability to maintain unit cohesion during the withdrawal reflected fundamental weaknesses in Russian military training and leadership that had been concealed by previous victories against less capable opponents. The battle's aftermath left over 90,000 Russian casualties on the field, while opening the route to Harbin and the Trans-Siberian Railway to Japanese advance. The destruction of the Russian Baltic Fleet at the Battle of Tsushima on May 27, 1905, provided the final demonstration of Russian military inadequacy and eliminated any possibility of reversing the war's outcome through naval action. Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky's fleet, which had sailed halfway around the world to reach the Pacific, represented the Empire's last hope for achieving naval superiority that might enable continued resistance to Japanese demands. The fleet's composition, including obsolete battleships and poorly trained crews, reflected the Russian Navy's fundamental weaknesses, while the 7-month voyage had exhausted both men and machinery before the decisive engagement. Admiral Heihachiro Togo's Japanese fleet, positioned to intercept the Russian ships as they approached the Korean Strait, possessed significant advantages in speed, firepower, and tactical coordination that would prove decisive in the coming battle. The Japanese vessels, including modern battleships and cruisers built in British shipyards, represented the latest developments in naval technology, while their crews had been trained according to the most advanced tactical principles. The positioning of Japanese forces, based on accurate intelligence about Russian movements and intentions, enabled Togo to choose the time and place of engagement while maximizing his fleet's advantages. The battle itself unfolded with devastating efficiency as Japanese gunners, trained to unprecedented levels of accuracy, systematically destroyed Russian ships that proved unable to respond effectively to the concentrated firepower directed against them. The Russian flagship Knyaz Suvorov, bearing Admiral Rozhestvensky's flag, became the focus of Japanese attention and was reduced to a burning wreck within hours of the engagement's beginning. The Admiral's severe wounds sustained early in the battle eliminated effective Russian command and control, while individual ship captains attempted to continue fighting without coordination or strategic direction. The complete destruction of the Russian fleet, with only 3 vessels escaping to neutral ports while the remainder were sunk or captured, marked the end of Russian naval power in the Pacific while demonstrating the futility of continued resistance to Japanese demands. The battle's outcome, achieved with minimal Japanese losses, provided dramatic evidence of the technological and tactical superiority that modern naval forces could achieve over opponents who lacked adequate training and equipment. The capture of Admiral Rozhestvensky and thousands of Russian sailors eliminated experienced naval personnel, while providing Japan with valuable intelligence about Russian military capabilities and intentions. The domestic impact of these military disasters proved far more significant than their immediate strategic consequences, as news of repeated defeats undermined popular confidence in the imperial government while providing revolutionary organizations with opportunities to mobilize opposition to autocratic rule. The war's enormous financial costs, estimated at over 2.3 billion rubles, strained the imperial treasury while requiring increased taxation that fell disproportionately on peasant and working-class populations already struggling with the effects of industrial transformation. The mobilization of reserves disrupted agricultural production and industrial operations, while creating resentment among families whose breadwinners had been sent to fight in a distant war that served no apparent Russian interests. The Revolution of 1905 began on January 9th with the Bloody Sunday Massacre, when troops fired on peaceful demonstrators led by Father Georgy Gapon, who were marching to petition the emperor for relief from economic hardship and political oppression. The procession, numbering over 100,000 workers and their families, carried icons, portraits of the emperor, and petitions requesting improved working conditions, political representation, and an end to the unpopular war. The demonstrators' peaceful intentions and religious character made the government's violent response particularly shocking to Russian society, while the killing of hundreds of unarmed civilians shattered the traditional image of the emperor as the benevolent father of his people. Father Gapon's role in organizing the demonstration reflected the complex relationship between religious authority and political opposition that characterized Russian society during this period. The priest's background as a police informant who had been recruited to channel worker discontent into harmless religious activities demonstrated the government's attempts to control popular movements through infiltration and manipulation. However, Gapon's genuine sympathy for working-class grievances and his belief that the emperor would respond favorably to respectful petitions reflected the persistence of traditional attitudes toward imperial authority even among those who criticized specific government policies. The massacre's immediate aftermath saw the spread of revolutionary activity throughout the empire as news of the government's violence against peaceful petitioners undermined the legitimacy of autocratic rule while providing revolutionary organizations with powerful propaganda tools. Strike activity, which had been increasing steadily during the previous months, expanded dramatically as workers in major industrial centers responded to Bloody Sunday with work stoppages that paralyzed production and transportation. The strike's political character, involving demands for constitutional government and civil liberties, rather than merely economic improvements, demonstrated the transformation of working-class consciousness that had occurred during the previous decade of rapid industrialization. The Potemkin Mutiny in June 1905 revealed the extent to which revolutionary sentiment had penetrated the armed forces, traditionally the most reliable pillar of autocratic authority. The crew's revolt against their officers, triggered by complaints about rotten meat and harsh discipline, escalated into a broader challenge to military hierarchy when the sailors took control of the battleship and sailed to Odessa seeking popular support. The mutiny's success in maintaining control of a major warship for several days demonstrated the weakness of military discipline while inspiring similar revolts in other naval units and army garrisons throughout the empire. The events at Odessa, where the Potemkin's arrival coincided with a general strike and widespread civil unrest, created a revolutionary situation that temporarily eliminated government authority, while demonstrating the potential for coordinated opposition to imperial rule. The burning of the port facilities, the establishment of revolutionary committees, and the fraternization between mutinous sailors and striking workers provided a model for revolutionary organization that would influence later uprisings. The government's eventual suppression of the revolt through military force and mass arrests demonstrated the regime's continued capacity for violence while revealing the isolation of revolutionary activities from the broader population. The Moscow Uprising in December 1905 represented the most serious challenge to imperial authority during the revolutionary period, as workers' organizations attempted to establish alternative government structures while engaging in armed resistance to imperial forces. The decision to call a general strike that would escalate into armed insurrection reflected the revolutionary leadership's belief that the government's weakness following the military defeats in the Far East created opportunities for successful rebellion. The establishment of barricades throughout the city, the seizure of government buildings, and the declaration of a provisional revolutionary government demonstrated the organizational capabilities that had developed among opposition groups during the previous months of revolutionary activity. The government's response to the Moscow Uprising involved the systematic use of military force to suppress revolutionary activities while demonstrating the regime's determination to maintain control regardless of the human costs involved. The deployment of the Semenovsky Guards Regiment, fresh from service in the Far East and experienced in combat operations, provided the government with reliable troops who could be counted upon to fire on civilian targets without hesitation. The artillery bombardment of working-class districts, the mass arrests of suspected revolutionaries, and the execution of captured insurgents created an atmosphere of terror that effectively eliminated organized resistance while generating resentment that would persist for years. The October Manifesto, issued by Nicholas II on October 30, 1905, represented the emperor's reluctant recognition that some form of constitutional government was necessary to restore political stability while maintaining the essential features of autocratic rule. The document's promises of civil liberties, an elected parliament, and limitations on imperial power reflected the influence of moderate advisors like Sergei Witte, who believed that limited concessions could satisfy popular demands while preserving the monarchy's essential authority. The manifesto's vague language and conditional promises reflected Nicholas's continued resistance to constitutional limitations, while providing sufficient ambiguity to allow different interpretations of its actual meaning. The establishment of the Duma as Russia's first elected parliament marked a historic transformation in Russian political life, while revealing the fundamental tensions between autocratic traditions and constitutional government. The electoral system, designed to ensure conservative majorities while providing representation for different social groups, reflected the government's attempt to create a parliamentary institution that would legitimize imperial rule rather than challenge it. The complex electoral procedures, which gave disproportionate influence to landowners and restricted the participation of workers and peasants, demonstrated the regime's fear of genuine popular representation while maintaining the appearance of democratic reform. The First Duma, which convened in April 1906, immediately challenged the government's expectations by demanding comprehensive political reforms that went far beyond the limited constitutional changes that Nicholas had envisioned. The Parliament's Liberal majority, dominated by the Constitutional Democratic Party, insisted on ministerial responsibility, comprehensive land reform, and the abolition of emergency laws that had been used to suppress revolutionary activities. The Duma's assertive approach to its constitutional role created immediate conflicts with the emperor and his advisors, who viewed the parliament as a consultative body rather than a co-equal branch of government. The dissolution of the First Duma after only 73 days demonstrated Nicholas's unwillingness to accept genuine constitutional limitations on his authority, while revealing the fundamental incompatibility between autocratic rule and parliamentary government. The emperor's decision to dismiss the parliament when it refused to moderate its demands reflected his belief that constitutional concessions had been tactical necessities rather than permanent commitments to shared power. The Viborg Manifesto, issued by dismissed Duma deputies calling for civil disobedience and tax resistance, demonstrated the continuing opposition to autocratic rule, while highlighting the government's failure to achieve genuine reconciliation with liberal opinion. The appointment of Pyotr Stolypin as Prime Minister in July 1906 brought to power a conservative reformer who believed that the monarchy's survival required systematic modernization of Russian society and economy while maintaining essential autocratic authority. Stolypin's background as a provincial governor who had successfully suppressed revolutionary activities provided him with practical experience in dealing with political opposition, while his understanding of agricultural conditions convinced him that land reform was essential for social stability. His famous declaration that the government needed 20 years of peace to implement necessary reforms reflected his recognition that Russia's transformation required time and stability that revolutionary agitation threatened to destroy. Stolypin's agricultural reforms, implemented through Article 87 of the Fundamental Laws while the Duma was not in session, represented the most ambitious attempt to transform Russian rural society since the abolition of serfdom. The legislation allowed individual peasants to withdraw from the commune system and establish private farms, while providing government assistance for land purchases and agricultural improvements. The reform's purpose involved creating a class of prosperous peasant proprietors who would support the existing political system while increasing agricultural productivity through more efficient farming methods. The government's willingness to use extraordinary legislative procedures to implement these changes demonstrated Stolypin's belief that administrative efficiency was more important than constitutional niceties. The implementation of the Stolypin reforms created significant social tensions within peasant communities as traditional collective decision-making processes were disrupted by individual decisions to leave the commune system. The peasants who chose to establish private farms, known as separators, often faced hostility from their former neighbours, who viewed their actions as betrayals of community solidarity. The violence that sometimes accompanied the partition of commune lands reflected deeper conflicts about the nature of Russian rural society and the appropriate relationship between individual rights and collective responsibilities. The reforms mixed results, with some regions experiencing significant agricultural improvements while others saw increased social conflict, demonstrated the complexity of transforming traditional social structures through government intervention. The assassination of Stolypin on September 14, 1911, at the Kiev Opera House, eliminated the most capable administrator of Nicholas II's reign, while symbolising the failure of moderate reform to satisfy either revolutionary opposition or conservative resistance to change. The assassin, Dmitry Bogrov, possessed connections to both revolutionary organisations and the secret police, reflecting the complex web of surveillance and counter-surveillance that characterised Russian political life during this period. The Prime Minister's death, occurring in the presence of the Emperor and his family, demonstrated the regime's continued vulnerability to terrorist attack, while eliminating the leadership necessary for continued reform efforts. The circumstances surrounding Stolypin's assassination revealed the incompetence and possible complicity of the security services that were supposed to protect government officials from revolutionary violence. The failure to detect Bogrov's weapon, despite extensive security precautions, suggested either gross negligence or deliberate sabotage by officials who opposed the Prime Minister's policies. The investigation's inconclusive results and the rapid execution of the assassin prevented a thorough examination of the security failures while generating conspiracy theories that further undermined confidence in government competence and loyalty. The outbreak of World War I in August 1914 initially provided the imperial government with an opportunity to rally popular support around patriotic themes, while postponing the resolution of domestic political conflicts that had been building since the 1905 revolution. Nicholas II's decision to enter the war in support of Serbia reflected both traditional Russian commitments to Slavic peoples and the influence of advisors who believed that military victory would restore imperial prestige while uniting Russian society behind the throne. The emperor's appearance on the balcony of the Winter Palace before cheering crowds seemed to demonstrate renewed popular loyalty, while the Duma's unanimous support for war credits suggested that constitutional conflicts could be set aside in the face of national emergency. The initial military mobilization proceeded with impressive efficiency, as millions of Russian soldiers reported to assembly points throughout the empire, while the railway system transported troops and supplies to the western frontiers. The army's size, numbering over 1.4 million men in peacetime and expanding to nearly 6 million through mobilization, appeared to provide overwhelming numerical superiority over German and Austrian forces. The soldiers' enthusiasm and traditional courage, demonstrated in countless previous conflicts, suggested that Russian military power would prove decisive in the coming struggle, despite the technological and organizational advantages that Germany possessed. The Battle of Tannenberg, fought from August 26th to August 30th, 1914, provided a devastating introduction to the realities of modern warfare, while demonstrating the inadequacy of Russian military leadership and organization. General Alexander Samsonov's Second Army, advancing into East Prussia according to plans designed to support French operations on the Western Front, became separated from General Pavel Rennenkampf's First Army and found itself isolated in hostile territory. The German commanders, Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, recognized the opportunity to defeat the Russian armies separately and concentrated their forces against Samsonov's exposed position. The encirclement of the Russian Second Army demonstrated the effectiveness of German military planning and the superiority of their communication systems over Russian command and control capabilities. The German forces, using interior lines and railway transportation, achieved local numerical superiority despite being outnumbered overall, while their coordination between different units contrasted sharply with Russian confusion and poor communication. The battle's outcome, with over 120,000 Russian casualties and the virtual destruction of an entire army, eliminated experienced troops and officers while providing Germany with a decisive victory that would influence the entire Eastern Front campaign. General Samsonov's suicide on August 29th, as his army disintegrated around him, symbolized the personal tragedy and military incompetence that characterized Russian performance throughout the war. The general's recognition that his failure would disgrace both his reputation and his country reflected the traditional honor code that governed Russian military culture, while his death eliminated a commander whose experience might have been valuable in future operations. The loss of most of the Second Army's officers and equipment created gaps in Russian military capabilities that would prove impossible to fill adequately throughout the remainder of the war. Alexei Brusilov's innovative tactics during the 1916 offensive had demonstrated that Russian forces could achieve tactical success when properly coordinated and supplied, but the strategic situation continued to deteriorate as the empire's economic and social fabric unraveled under the strain of total war. The offensive's initial breakthrough against Austrian positions in Galicia, achieved through simultaneous attacks along a 200-mile front, had caught enemy forces unprepared and resulted in the capture of over 350,000 prisoners. However, the operation's ultimate failure to achieve decisive results, combined with its enormous cost in Russian casualties, exemplified the fundamental problems that plagued the empire's war effort throughout 1916 and early 1917. The home front's collapse accelerated dramatically during the winter of 1916 to 1917, as the transportation system, already strained by military demands, proved unable to deliver adequate food supplies to major cities. The railway network, which had been designed primarily to move troops and military supplies to the western frontiers, lacked the capacity to simultaneously maintain civilian distribution systems that had become essential for urban survival. Bread lines formed in Petrograd and Moscow as early as December 1916, while the government's price controls and requisition policies disrupted normal market mechanisms without providing effective alternatives for food distribution. The influence of Grigory Rasputin over the imperial family reached its zenith during this period, creating a political scandal that further undermined the monarchy's credibility among both the educated classes and the general population. The Siberian peasants' apparent ability to control the haemophilia attacks suffered by Tsarevich Alexei had made him indispensable to Empress Alexandra, who viewed his presence as divinely ordained protection for her son and the dynasty. Rasputin's crude manners, scandalous personal behaviour, and obvious manipulation of imperial appointments created widespread revulsion among the nobility and government officials, while his German-born patron's unpopularity made the entire arrangement appear treasonous to many Russians. The murder of Rasputin on December 30th, 1916, by a group of nobles led by Prince Felix Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, represented a desperate attempt by members of the imperial family to save the monarchy from the scandals that surrounded the controversial holy man. The assassination's brutal nature, involving poison, gunshots, and drowning in the Neva River, reflected the killer's determination to eliminate Rasputin permanently while sending a message about the consequences of manipulating imperial authority. However, the murder's aftermath only deepened the imperial family's isolation, as Nicholas II's decision to exile the conspirators rather than reward them for their patriotic service demonstrated his continued inability to understand the political realities surrounding his throne. The February Revolution began on March 8th, 1917, with spontaneous demonstrations by women textile workers in Petrograd, who were protesting bread shortages and demanding an end to the war that had consumed their husbands and sons. The International Women's Day protests, initially involving only a few thousand participants, quickly expanded as workers from other industries joined the demonstrations, while police proved unable or unwilling to disperse the growing crowds. The protesters' demands evolved rapidly from economic grievances to political slogans, calling for the abdication of the emperor and the establishment of a republic, reflecting the complete breakdown of popular confidence in imperial authority. The military garrison's refusal to fire on demonstrators marked the decisive moment when the revolution became irreversible, as the troops who had been ordered to suppress the protests instead joined the crowds and turned their weapons against their officers. The Volinsky Regiment's mutiny on March 11th triggered a cascade of military revolts throughout the capital as soldiers, many of whom were recent conscripts with little loyalty to the imperial system, recognized that the revolution offered them escape from the brutal discipline and hopeless casualties of continued warfare. The sight of soldiers marching alongside workers while carrying red flags and revolutionary banners demonstrated the complete collapse of military discipline that had been the foundation of autocratic rule. The formation of the Provisional Government on March 15, 1917, represented the liberal politicians' attempt to create a constitutional regime that would continue the war effort while implementing democratic reforms that had been demanded since 1905. Prince Georgy Lvov, who became the new government's first prime minister, embodied the moderate liberalism that had characterized the Constitutional Democratic Party's approach to political reform. His background as a Zemstvo leader and his reputation for administrative competence suggested that the new regime might successfully navigate the transition from autocracy to democracy while maintaining Russia's commitments to its wartime allies. The provisional government's composition reflected the political forces that had emerged during the previous decade of constitutional development, with ministers drawn primarily from the parties that had participated in the Duma's opposition to autocratic rule. Pavel Milyukov, the historian and constitutional democratic leader who became foreign minister, brought intellectual distinction and international recognition to the new government, while his commitment to liberal principles and constitutional government provided ideological coherence to the revolutionary regime. Alexander Kerensky, the only socialist in the initial cabinet, served as a bridge between the moderate liberals who controlled the government and the radical socialists who dominated the Petrograd Soviet. The dual power arrangement that emerged in the revolution's aftermath created an inherently unstable political situation, as the provisional government claimed legal authority while the Petrograd Soviet exercised practical control over the workers and soldiers who had made the revolution possible. The Soviet's formation on March 12, 1917, brought together representatives from factories and military units throughout the capital in a body that claimed to speak for the revolutionary masses, while challenging the provisional government's right to make decisions about war and peace. The Soviets' famous Order No. 1, which established soldiers' committees and eliminated traditional military discipline, effectively destroyed the army's command structure, while ensuring that military units would obey the Soviet rather than the government. Nicholas II's abdication on March 15, 1917, at the Pskov railway station, marked the end of over 3 centuries of Romanov rule and the collapse of the autocratic system that had governed Russia since the time of troubles. The emperor's decision to renounce the throne for both himself and his son Alexei in favour of his brother Grand Duke Michael reflected his recognition that continued resistance would only prolong the civil conflict while endangering his family's safety. The abdication manifesto's language, emphasising the emperor's desire to serve Russia's interests rather than his own, provided a dignified conclusion to his reign while acknowledging the complete failure of his policies and leadership. Grand Duke Michael's refusal to accept the crown without guarantees from a constituent assembly effectively ended the Romanov dynasty and completed the transformation of Russia from an autocratic empire to a provisional republic. The Grand Duke's decision, influenced by his recognition that accepting the throne would make him a target for revolutionary violence, demonstrated the dynasty's complete loss of support among all segments of Russian society. The monarchy's peaceful demise, achieved without the dramatic executions that had characterized previous European revolutions, initially suggested that Russia's transition to democracy might avoid the extremes of violence that had marked similar transformations in other countries. The provisional government's decision to continue the war effort despite overwhelming popular opposition to further military operations represented the fatal error that would ultimately destroy the moderate revolution and pave the way for Bolshevik victory. The government's commitment to honouring Russia's obligations to Britain and France reflected both ideological conviction about democratic solidarity and practical concerns about maintaining Western support for the revolutionary regime. However, the continuation of military operations that had already cost millions of Russian lives contradicted the revolution's popular mandate, while providing the Bolsheviks with their most effective propaganda weapon against the moderate government. The April Theses, presented by Vladimir Lenin immediately upon his return to Russia on April 16, 1917, outlined the radical strategy that would enable the Bolsheviks to seize power by positioning themselves as the only party committed to immediate peace, land redistribution, and workers' control of industry. Lenin's demand for an immediate end to the war, regardless of the consequences for Russia's allies, directly appealed to the war-weary population, while distinguishing the Bolsheviks from other socialist parties that supported the provisional government's continuation of military operations. His slogan, "Peace, Land, Bread," provided a simple but powerful program that addressed the 3 issues most important to ordinary Russians, while offering concrete benefits that the moderate government had failed to deliver. The July Days crisis demonstrated the provisional government's continuing weakness while revealing the Bolsheviks' growing influence among the radicalized workers and soldiers of Petrograd. The spontaneous uprising, triggered by the government's decision to launch a new military offensive, brought thousands of armed demonstrators into the streets, demanding the transfer of power to the Soviets. The Bolsheviks' initial hesitation to support the uprising, followed by their decision to provide leadership to the movement, reflected Lenin's tactical flexibility and his understanding that premature action might destroy the party's growing influence. The government's successful suppression of the uprising, achieved through the use of loyal military units and the publication of documents allegedly proving Lenin's German connections, temporarily weakened Bolshevik influence while demonstrating the regime's continued capacity for decisive action. Alexander Kerensky's appointment as Prime Minister in July 1917 represented the moderate socialists' last attempt to create a stable government that could satisfy both revolutionary demands and practical necessities of wartime administration. Kerensky's background as a lawyer and his reputation as an eloquent speaker had made him one of the revolution's most popular figures, while his membership in both the provisional government and the Soviet Executive Committee positioned him uniquely to bridge the gap between competing revolutionary factions. His theatrical speaking style and his ability to inspire audiences with passionate appeals to patriotic duty suggested that he might successfully rally popular support for continued resistance to German invasion. The Kornilov affair in August 1917 marked the turning point that would ultimately lead to Bolshevik victory by destroying the moderate government's credibility while providing the radical left with weapons and organisation that would prove decisive in the coming struggle for power. General Lavra-Kornilov's march on Petrograd, ostensibly to restore order and strengthen the war effort, created a crisis that forced Kerensky to arm the Bolsheviks and other radical groups in defence of the revolution. The general's failure to reach the capital, caused by the railway workers' refusal to transport his troops and the disintegration of his forces through revolutionary propaganda, eliminated the threat of military dictatorship while leaving the Bolsheviks with weapons and enhanced prestige as defenders of revolutionary gains. The Bolshevik seizure of power during the October Revolution represented the culmination of Lenin's strategy of exploiting the provisional government's weaknesses while positioning his party as the only force capable of implementing the radical changes that the Russian people demanded. The revolution's planning, directed by Leon Trotsky as chairman of the Petrograd Soviet's Military Revolutionary Committee, demonstrated the organizational capabilities that the Bolsheviks had developed during months of preparation for the decisive confrontation. The capture of key points throughout Petrograd, including the telegraph office, railway stations and government buildings, proceeded with remarkable efficiency as the provisional government supporters melted away in the face of determined opposition. The storming of the Winter Palace on November 7, 1917, provided the dramatic climax to the Bolshevik Revolution while demonstrating the complete collapse of resistance to the new regime. The palace's defence, entrusted to a women's battalion and a handful of military cadets, reflected the provisional government's isolation and the unwillingness of regular military units to fight for a regime that had lost all popular support. The palace's capture, achieved after minimal resistance and with remarkably few casualties, enabled the Bolsheviks to arrest the remaining government ministers while establishing their control over the symbols of state power. Lenin's immediate implementation of radical policies, including the Decree on Peace and the Decree on Land, fulfilled the promises that had enabled the Bolsheviks to gain popular support while demonstrating their commitment to revolutionary transformation. The peace decree's call for immediate negotiations to end the war, without annexations or indemnities, appealed directly to the war-weary population, while challenging the other belligerent powers to accept reasonable terms for ending the conflict. The land decree's authorization of peasant seizures of noble estates legitimized the rural revolution that had been occurring spontaneously throughout 1917 while ensuring Bolshevik support in the countryside. The dissolution of the Constituent Assembly on January 18, 1918, marked the definitive end of Russia's brief experiment with democratic government and the establishment of Bolshevik dictatorship that would characterize the Soviet system for the next 7 decades. The Assembly's composition, reflecting the election results from November 1917, gave the Socialist Revolutionary Party a majority that would have enabled it to form a government committed to democratic socialism and continued resistance to German expansion. Lenin's decision to disperse the assembly after a single day's session demonstrated his recognition that democratic institutions were incompatible with the revolutionary transformation that he intended to implement. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed on March 3, 1918, represented the price that the Bolsheviks paid for ending Russian participation in World War I, while revealing the extent of German territorial ambitions in Eastern Europe. The treaty's terms, involving the loss of Poland, the Baltic provinces, Finland, and Ukraine, eliminated approximately 1/3 of the Russian Empire's European territory, while depriving the new Soviet state of crucial agricultural and industrial resources. Lenin's acceptance of these humiliating conditions reflected his understanding that the Bolshevik regime's survival depended on ending the war that had destroyed its predecessors, regardless of the territorial costs involved. The outbreak of the Russian Civil War in 1918 created the conditions that would ultimately lead to the murder of the Romanov family, while demonstrating the Bolsheviks' determination to eliminate all potential symbols of counter-revolutionary resistance. The formation of the White Army under generals like Anton Denikin and Alexander Kolchak provided the Bolsheviks' opponents with military leadership and international support that threatened to overthrow the new regime. The Civil War's brutal nature, involving mass executions, forced requisitions, and the systematic destruction of entire social classes, created an atmosphere of terror that would characterize Soviet rule throughout its existence. the execution of Nicholas II and his family on July 17, 1918, in the basement of the Apatiev house in Ekaterinburg, represented the Bolsheviks' determination to eliminate any possibility of monarchist restoration, while demonstrating their willingness to use extreme violence to maintain power. The decision to kill the entire family, including the 4 daughters and the haemophiliac son Alexei, reflected the revolutionaries' belief that any surviving Romanov could serve as a rallying point for counter-revolutionary forces. The murder's brutal nature, involving gunshots and bayonet thrusts in a confined space, created a scene of horror that would haunt Russian memory for generations, while symbolizing the complete destruction of the old order. The cover-up of the executions, including the destruction of the bodies and the false claims that only the emperor had been killed, demonstrated the Bolsheviks' recognition that their actions would be condemned by both domestic and international opinion. The disposal of the remains in an abandoned mineshaft, followed by their removal and burial in unmarked graves, reflected the killer's understanding that the murders represented crimes that could not be publicly acknowledged or defended. The mystery surrounding the family's fate, maintained for decades by Soviet authorities, created legends and conspiracy theories that would persist long after the regime's collapse. The fall of the Russian Empire represented one of the most significant transformations in world history, ending a political system that had endured for over 4 centuries while creating conditions that would influence global politics throughout the 20th century. The empire's collapse resulted from the interaction of multiple factors, including military defeat, economic breakdown, social revolution, and the personal inadequacies of Nicholas II, but the underlying cause lay in the autocratic system's inability to adapt to the demands of modern industrial society. The Romanov dynasty's failure to implement constitutional government, address social inequalities, or create institutions that could channel popular participation constructively, left Russia vulnerable to the radical solutions that the Bolsheviks provided. The empire's legacy extended far beyond Russia's borders, influencing the development of the Soviet Union, the course of World War I, and the subsequent history of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The territorial losses that resulted from the empire's collapse created new nation-states that would struggle with questions of identity and governance throughout the 20th century, while the revolutionary model that emerged from Russia's transformation would inspire communist movements worldwide. The human cost of the empire's collapse, measured in millions of deaths from war, revolution and civil conflict, demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of political systems that fail to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their authority through force alone. The Russian Empire's end marked the conclusion of an era in which traditional autocratic institutions had governed vast territories and diverse populations through personal rule and bureaucratic administration. The empire's achievements, including territorial expansion, cultural development, and military power, had made Russia a major factor in European and world politics for over 2 centuries. However, the system's ultimate failure to create sustainable institutions that could survive the challenges of modern warfare and social transformation revealed the fundamental weaknesses that had been concealed by military success and territorial expansion. The Romanov dynasty's tragic fate served as a reminder that political legitimacy in the modern world requires more than historical precedent and traditional authority, demanding instead the creation of institutions that can adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining popular support and effective governance.